In the early years of the Cold War, France faced a problem of prestige. The nation had emerged from World War II battered but determined to reclaim its status as a global power. Nuclear weapons had become the ultimate symbol of sovereignty, strength, and independence. To possess them was to matter. To lack them was to depend on others. France chose possession. In 1960, deep in the Algerian Sahara, the French military detonated its first atomic bomb. The explosion tore through the desert sky with a force that few outside the command structure fully understood. Officially, it was a triumph of science and national pride. Unofficially, it was the beginning of one of the most severe and least acknowledged environmental and human disasters in modern French history. The test was codenamed Gerbes Bleu. Its power exceeded expectations. Radioactive fallout spread far beyond the designated test zone, carried by wind patterns that planners had either miscalculated or ignored. Nomadic communities, military conscripts, and nearby civilian populations were directly exposed. Many had no warning. Some were deliberately positioned close to the blast to observe the effects. French soldiers were ordered to march toward the explosion site shortly after detonation. They were not informed of the risks. Protective equipment was minimal. Decontamination procedures were improvised. Official reports later described exposure levels as acceptable. Internal documents would eventually reveal that they were anything but. The Sahara tests continued over the next several years. Each explosion added radioactive contamination to the land, the air, and the bodies of those who lived and worked nearby. The region became a laboratory, not only for weapons, but for human exposure. Then history intervened. Algeria won its independence in 1962. Publicly, France ended its colonial rule. Privately, it negotiated secret agreements that allowed nuclear testing to continue on Algerian soil. The explosions did not stop. They simply became less visible. By the mid-1960s, international pressure forced France to relocate its nuclear testing program. The new site was thousands of kilometers away, in the South Pacific. Remote islands, far from mainland France. Places that could be described as isolated, expendable, and politically convenient. Mururoa and Fangatofa. French Polynesia was portrayed as an ideal testing ground. The population was small. The islands were distant. The fallout, officials claimed, would disperse harmlessly over the ocean. This assurance would become one of the most persistent falsehoods of the nuclear age. Between 1966 and 1996, France conducted 193 nuclear tests in the Pacific, both atmospheric and underground. The early atmospheric explosions were especially dangerous. Radioactive clouds rose into the sky and drifted across inhabited islands. Rain carried radioactive particles into soil, water supplies, crops, and lagoons. Local populations were not evacuated. Information was tightly controlled. French authorities assured Polynesians that there was no danger. When radiation levels spiked, measurements were classified. When contamination reached populated areas, it was downplayed or denied. Children drank contaminated milk. Families consumed irradiated fish. Entire communities lived beneath invisible fallout without knowing it. French military personnel stationed on the islands were also exposed. Like their counterparts in Algeria, they were rarely informed of the risks. Many were ordered to remain outdoors during tests to observe the explosions. Protective gear was inconsistent. Long-term health monitoring was non-existent. Years later, cancers began to appear. Thyroid cancer, leukemia, rare blood disorders, birth defects, miscarriages, patterns emerged that could not be explained away as coincidence, yet official recognition lagged behind reality. For decades, the French government maintained that the tests were safe. Studies commissioned by state institutions concluded that exposure levels were too low to cause harm. Victims were told there was no proven link between their illnesses and nuclear testing. Behind the scenes, classified military reports told a different story. Internal assessments acknowledged radioactive contamination far beyond permitted thresholds. Fallout maps showed exposure reaching populated islands previously declared unaffected. Food contamination exceeded safety limits. These findings were buried under layers of secrecy justified by national security. The cost of nuclear independence was being paid by people who had never been asked for consent. As the Cold War ended, France continued testing. Underground detonations replaced atmospheric blasts, but radioactive leakage persisted. Cracks formed in coral atolls. Seawater infiltrated underground test cavities. Scientists warned of long-term structural instability. Their concerns were dismissed. The program only ended in 1996, under international pressure and mounting protest. By then, an entire generation had lived under the shadow of nuclear fallout, unknowingly exposed, systematically misled, and officially forgotten. The explosions were over. The contamination was not. And the reckoning had only just begun. As the years passed, the physical evidence of contamination accumulated faster than the official explanations meant to contain it. Radiation did not remain confined to test sites or military zones. It moved through wind, water, food, and bodies. What could not be hidden on the ground was buried on paper. By the 1970s, French monitoring stations in the Pacific were recording radiation levels that contradicted public assurances. Fallout reached islands hundreds of kilometers away from Mururoa and Fangatofa. Rainfall carried radioactive particles into cisterns that supplied drinking water. Local produce absorbed contamination. Fish populations tested positive for radioactive isotopes. None of this information reached the public. Instead, measurements were selectively reported. Peaks were averaged down. Dangerous readings were excluded entirely. When internal scientists raised concerns, their reports were classified or rewritten. The official narrative remained unchanged. There was no significant risk to the population. Medical data followed the same pattern. Doctors working in French Polynesia began noticing abnormal increases in certain cancers, particularly thyroid cancer, which is strongly associated with radioactive iodine exposure. They also documented unusually high rates of miscarriages and congenital abnormalities. These observations were treated as anecdotal, unscientific, or coincidental. No large-scale epidemiological study was authorized. Without official recognition, there was no obligation to act. Without data, there was no accountability. The absence of proof became proof of absence. French military personnel faced a similar wall. Veterans who developed cancers years after their service were told they could not establish causation. Exposure records were incomplete or missing. Dosimeters, when they existed at all, were often collected inaccurately or lost. Some soldiers later discovered that their exposure levels had been retroactively altered in official files. The system was designed to forget. In Algeria, the situation was even more severe. Test sites were abandoned without proper containment. Radioactive debris remained scattered across the desert. Local populations continued to live, graze animals, and draw water from contaminated land. France retained control over key information long after Algerian independence, limiting any possibility of assessment or remediation. The affected communities had no access to courts, compensation mechanisms, or international advocacy. Their exposure was not just ignored, it was erased. By the 1980s, cracks began to appear in the official story. Independent journalists gained access to leaked military documents. Former scientists spoke anonymously about suppressed data. Environmental groups conducted their own measurements, confirming contamination in areas the government had declared safe. Each revelation was met with denial. French authorities dismissed critics as alarmist. They accused activists of exaggeration. They insisted that any health effects were statistically insignificant. The narrative of national responsibility remained intact, protected by secrecy laws and institutional inertia. This denial was not passive, it was actively maintained. When victims sought recognition, they were required to meet impossible standards of proof. They had to demonstrate direct exposure, precise dosage, and causal linkage decades after the fact, without access to classified records. The burden was placed entirely on those who had been misled. Most claims were rejected. In 2010, under sustained pressure, France passed a law intended to compensate victims of nuclear testing. On paper, it appeared to be a breakthrough. In practice, it was another barrier. The criteria were narrow. The list of recognized illnesses was limited. Exposure zones were defined conservatively. A presumption of causality existed in theory, but was undermined by administrative discretion. Committees routinely denied claims using technical justifications. Years later, the rejection rate remained overwhelmingly high. For many victims, the law arrived too late. Some had already died. Others were too ill to navigate the process. Families were left with medical bills, unanswered questions, and a sense of abandonment. The environmental consequences were similarly unresolved. Studies showed that underground tests had fractured coral foundations, creating pathways for radioactive material to enter the ocean. Scientists warned that long-term leakage was inevitable. Monitoring continued, but full transparency did not. The islands remained inhabited. Life went on atop contaminated ground. What made the situation uniquely devastating was not only the exposure, but the deception. Entire communities had trusted official reassurances. They had continued daily life under false information. They had raised children, consumed local food, and built futures in places they were told were safe. The betrayal was systematic. France's nuclear program had achieved its goal. The country secured its place as a nuclear power. Strategic independence was preserved. International standing was reinforced. The cost, however, was displaced onto populations with no political leverage. By the time acknowledgement began to emerge, it was framed carefully. Mistakes were admitted without culpability. Harm was recognized without responsibility. Compensation was offered without justice. The narrative shifted from denial to minimization. The tests were over. The damage was described as limited. The chapter was declared closed. But for those living with cancer, genetic damage, and environmental contamination, the story was not history. It was ongoing. An entire generation had been exposed not just to radiation, but to silence. And silence, unlike fallout, leaves no visible trace until it is too late to undo. By the time the Cold War had ended, the nuclear tests were no longer detonating in the atmosphere or beneath the ground, but their consequences had already embedded themselves into bodies, records, and landscapes. What followed was not resolution, but a prolonged struggle over memory, responsibility, and control of truth. The first real threat to France's official narrative came not from governments, but from archives. In the 1990s and early 2000s, previously sealed military and scientific documents began to surface. Some were released under pressure. Others were leaked by insiders who had spent decades watching the gap between internal knowledge and public statements grow impossible to justify. These documents revealed that French authorities had been aware of radioactive fallout reaching civilian populations from the earliest years of testing. Maps showed contamination zones extending far beyond the areas publicly acknowledged. Internal risk assessments contradicted press briefings. Memoranda discussed acceptable exposure thresholds that exceeded international safety standards, justified by strategic necessity. The tests had never been as controlled as claimed. One of the most damaging revelations concerned fallout modeling. Military scientists had calculated that weather conditions frequently carried radioactive clouds directly over inhabited islands. These projections were known in advance. Tests were not postponed. Instead, authorities chose not to inform local populations, fearing disruption, protest, or international scrutiny. People were exposed knowingly, not accidentally. As more documents emerged, the scale of the deception became undeniable. Radiation measurements taken immediately after detonations were sometimes classified for decades. In other cases, raw data was altered before publication. Peaks were smoothed. Dangerous readings were reassigned to uninhabited zones. The historical record had been engineered. International pressure slowly increased. Environmental organizations demanded independent assessments. Polynesian leaders called for transparency. Survivors formed advocacy groups, collecting testimonies and medical histories that painted a consistent picture of widespread harm. France responded cautiously. Acknowledgement came in fragments. Officials conceded that some exposure had occurred, but emphasized uncertainty. They framed the issue as a matter of evolving scientific understanding rather than deliberate concealment. Responsibility was diffused across time, institutions, and technical complexity. The language was precise, accountability was not. Legal challenges followed. Victims brought cases before French courts, arguing that the state had failed in its duty of care. These cases faced immediate obstacles. Much of the relevant evidence remained classified. Statutes of limitation were invoked. Causation standards were set so high that few could meet them. In many cases, courts ruled that while harm was tragic, responsibility could not be conclusively established. The same pattern repeated internationally. Attempts to raise the issue at the United Nations encountered diplomatic resistance. Nuclear powers were reluctant to set precedents that could implicate their own histories. Discussions focused on nonproliferation, not reparations. The victims existed outside strategic priorities. Scientific studies continued to accumulate. Independent researchers confirmed elevated cancer rates in exposed populations. Genetic studies suggested long-term hereditary effects. Marine biologists documented persistent contamination in sediment and ecosystems surrounding test sites. Yet comprehensive cleanup remained elusive. Mururoa and Fangatofa were declared stabilized, but concerns persisted about underground cavities created by explosions. Structural weaknesses in the atolls raised fears of collapse or leakage. Monitoring systems detected anomalies, but full data access was restricted. The tests might have ended, but containment was never absolute. The psychological toll deepened alongside the physical. Communities struggled with uncertainty about their own bodies and futures. Questions about fertility, inherited illness, and environmental safety remained unanswered. The absence of clear acknowledgement amplified mistrust. What harmed people was not only radiation, but the prolonged refusal to confront its consequences. France's compensation system continued to operate, but rejection rates remained high. Victims received letters citing insufficient proof or ineligible exposure zones. Appeals dragged on for years. Many applicants died before decisions were reached. Each denial reinforced the sense that the system was designed to exhaust rather than assist. Public opinion within France slowly shifted as investigative journalism brought the issue into mainstream awareness. Documentaries aired. Parliamentary inquiries were launched. Politicians acknowledged moral responsibility while avoiding legal admission. The past was described as regrettable but necessary. In former test regions, the legacy was impossible to abstract. Cemeteries filled with victims whose illnesses shared common patterns. Families compared histories and found repetition where coincidence was once assumed. The silence that had protected the program now isolated its victims. Memory became a form of resistance. By the 2010s, the narrative had changed, but not enough. France no longer denied that harm occurred. It denied that harm was widespread. It no longer denied exposure. It minimized its extent. It no longer denied responsibility outright. It constrained it within administrative boundaries. Truth emerged slowly, diluted by time and bureaucracy. What remained undeniable was the imbalance of power that defined the entire episode. Decisions had been made by distant institutions, justified by national security, and imposed on populations with no voice in the process. The risks were calculated. The benefits were centralized. The consequences were externalized. An entire generation bore the cost of a deterrent they did not choose. As archives continued to open, one conclusion became unavoidable. The damage was not an unforeseen byproduct of technological ambition. It was the predictable outcome of prioritizing secrecy over safety, strategy over humanity. The tests were never just explosions in remote places. They were decisions that traveled through air, water, bloodlines, and decades. And even as the last files were unsealed, the final accounting remained unfinished, because acknowledgement without accountability does not close history. It only delays it.